Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman, and it's my privilege to serve as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank Israel Policy Forum supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. Israel Policy Forum relies on donors produce free expert analysis and informational content on the most pressing issues affecting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, such as today's briefing. If you enjoy Israel Policy Forum's webinars but don't yet support the organization's work, please do so by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. Now to the matters at hand. On Sunday, a Palestinian murdered 2 young Israelis driving through the West Bank town of Huwara, to which hundreds of settlers responded by rampaging against Huwara's Palestinian residents, murdering 1 Palestinian, injuring over 100, and burning buildings and property. This Palestinian attack and its escalating settler violence come on the heels of several fatal terror attacks against Israeli Jews and daytime IDF operations into Area A that devolved into violent clashes. Meanwhile, top ministers in Israel's far-right government are inciting violence and calling for collective punishment against Palestinians as a weakened Palestinian Authority cedes ground to militant groups. To unpack the current West Bank security situation and the state of the Israeli-Palestinian arena, we are so grateful to be joined today by Amos Harel, Haaretz's military correspondent. I just want to say, Amos, it was really a pleasure meeting with you in person a week and a half ago in Israel, in Tel Aviv. You, at the time, felt a little bit more optimistic than you had in the previous 2 weeks, as I recall. But of course, the situation since that meeting on February 16th has gone from bad to much worse. So to start off, could you please give us a recap of what happened in Huwara on Sunday? What transpired? How does this fit into the wider political and social trends in Israeli and Palestinian society and the escalating violence we've seen in the past few months?
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. You mentioned us meeting 10 days ago. It seems like a month or 2 ago, and I can't even recall if I was more optimistic. I remain optimistic in the long run. I think we have to go through some very difficult stages before we see any kind of light at the end of the tunnel. So right now, let's discuss what happened on Sunday. As you mentioned, this round of violence, it's all a cycle after cycle of violence, of course, but this round of violence started in an incident around 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the village of Huwara. Now, to get people to understand the terrain, Huwara is the main road into Nablus, which is one of the most important towns in the West Bank. And Huwara itself is a village by Palestinian standards quite prosperous, and it relies quite a lot on Israelis still coming to visit and buy and so on. Mostly Arab Israelis, but all of the transportation into Nablus, whether Palestinian mostly, but also Jews traveling into the settlements around Nablus, goes through this road. Usually the army is there to maintain security from the Israeli side. There are different clashes, but not many incidents in which people use actual weapons. In this case, two brothers, Harel and Yaniv, from the close-by settlement of Har Bracha, were on their way, I think, as yeshiva students to study somewhere, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere up north. A Palestinian terrorist waited on the side of the road, barged into the middle of the street while traffic was pretty heavy, and shot at them from very close range, 12 shots through his revolver, killing both on sight. As usual, IDF forces appeared on the site slightly later, and a massive manhunt began. It appears that the IDF and Shin Bet, the security services, are aware of the identity of the gunman. He's Palestinian, of course. He's from the Nablus area, and if I'm not mistaken, it seems that he's a member of a relatively new organization called the Lion's Den. Lion's Den, Arin al-Usud, is a local Palestinian organization fighting Israel, of course. It has no specific organizational identity. It's not part of Hamas or Fatah or the Popular Front or Islamic Jihad or anything else. This is local. It's based in the Balata refugee camp and mostly in the Kasbah, the old ancient town center in Nablus. And its members are young, relatively young people, armed, of course, who swore to fight Israel and say that they belong neither to the Sultan, to the Palestinian Authority, or to Hamas. And they started being involved in attacks against Israel, I'd say 8 or 10 months ago. There were quite a few massive operations on the Israeli side trying to either arrest or assassinate the leaders of this group, which there are a few dozen members active in Nablus. In late October, the IDF more or less proclaimed victory after arresting some of its members, the leading members. And of course, as usual, it turned out that this was quite a short victory. I mean, it didn't stand for a long time. Within a few months, they were back in action. And even recently, just last week, there was an operation inside Nablus in daylight, where the IDF made an incursion in order to arrest more members of the group, and 11 Palestinians were killed during that operation. A heavy gunfire all over the center of Nablus. 8 among the dead were gunmen from the organization. The other 3 were elderly people not involved, Palestinian civilians who got caught in the crossfire. So it was quite clear that there will be a retaliation, and this is what actually happened. So the manhunt began almost immediately. It's quite rare, but although 3 days have passed, the IDF still hasn't caught the gunman. I assume that he will be found. In most of these cases, these guys fight until they die. They refuse to surrender, and I assume that this would happen again in this case as well. But the clash itself, the incident itself, although there were, as you mentioned, previous attacks recently, already 14 Israelis and more than 50 Palestinians died since the beginning of this year. And this was also the beginning of the new term of the current Netanyahu government. So these are very high numbers compared to what we are used to in recent years. It's more significant than that because it was a strike at the heart of the settlement movement. These are, I'd say, these are isolated settlements deep inside Palestinian territory. Most of the people who live there are deeply ideological. Many of them belong to far-right groups and support far-right parties like the Ben Gvir and Smotrich parties. And it's no surprise that the reaction was quite aggressive. What happened, we'll probably discuss that later on, but as you mentioned, there was a retaliation attack. Actually, a pogrom is the right word to use, in spite of the historic memories as Jews and so on. This is what this is the term that the Israeli media is using. It was a pogrom, and it was done intentionally by dozens, if not hundreds, of hardcore settlers, of far-right settlers, who burned down stores and homes all over the village of Huwara for a few hours. And what I found most disturbing, perhaps, was the fact that the IDF failed to act, failed to intervene. It took them a long time until they understood that something that serious was happening, and until they started preventing the settlers from more retaliation. And people who visited Huwara the day after said that it looked after as if it passed as a sort of almost a hurricane went through the main streets of the village. This is quite, it's of course concerning. It's troubling. The tragedy begins in the deaths of those two young men, 22 and 21, young brothers. It's heartbreaking to see the funeral and the family pictures and so on. But also what happened after that is extremely worrying. From a strategic point of view, if you'd like, this means more escalation and more violence, and a cycle of violence that will continue in the West Bank. From a moral point of view, I think it's extremely troubling for us as Jews and Israelis to watch that, because what we watch, and I apologize for the quite blunt language that I'm using, is a sort of a local KKK on a rampage all through the streets of Huwara. This is something that as Jews and Israelis we cannot permit.
Thank you for that, Amos. And by the way, I saw it was reported, I forget now which IDF commander, but also someone in the IDF, it sounded like a rather important position, was calling this a pogrom as well. So it isn't just the media calling it a pogrom.
Yeah.
If the IDF is saying it's a pogrom, that should be taken seriously. The other piece that I think is troubling is that I understand that there were 3 settlers who were taken into custody and then released. So it sounds to me, almost, unless I'm wrong, that there are no repercussions when it comes to Jewish terrorists.
Okay, so I think the verdict is not out yet on this incident. Okay. It's quite clear that the IDF and Shin Bet and police were very slow to react. It's quite evident that they should have prepared themselves differently, because I can tell you from a personal point of view that I filed my first story, my first analysis at about 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And when I sent it to the newspaper, it was published later, but you'll have to believe me here. I wrote that Huwara is the main target. And so if it's clear to me and other journalists as well, it should have been clear to the army. You didn't have to be a genius to figure that out, because this is where settlers have struck in the past. And this was the incident. This was the scene of the crime, so to speak. Yet having said that, I think that what I'm sensing from the reaction of the security apparatus and the Shin Bet as well is that there are going to be arrests, and there are going to be attempts at least to bring these people to justice. I'm not sure this would succeed more than anything else because of the political situation. The fact that people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are part of the government, the fact that the deputy head of the local council of the Samaria area actually tweeted 2 hours before the attacks began that after the incident, after the 2 brothers were murdered, he tweeted something along the lines of Huwara should be wiped off the face of the earth and it is time for retaliation. The fact that Smotrich actually liked that tweet immediately after that, this sends quite a clear message about where we are right now, and about the fact that many of these people actually enjoy the support of some of the strongest and the most influential people in Israel, politicians who are parts of this government, which is, as you probably know, is the most extreme, the far-right government that we've ever had in the history of the state of Israel.
Almost, there are a couple of, it begs a rhetorical question, which is, as you know, Ben-Gvir is in favor of legislation that would make terrorism punishable by death. Until now, Israel has executed only 1 person in the history of the state, and that was Adolf Eichmann. It does beg the question whether or not, if this legislation goes forward, it would apply to Jewish terrorists as well as Palestinian terrorists. I somewhat have my doubts, but let me keep going here with you. So, as we know, the violence this past Sunday coincided with the security summit in Aqaba that was attended by Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, Egyptian, and U.S. officials. The summit had sought to address the escalating violence in the West Bank and prevent further deterioration heading into Ramadan and Pesach. A joint communique was released after the summit that stated Israel had agreed to pause settlement construction for several months as a de-escalatory measure, but Prime Minister Netanyahu denied that his government would implement any such freeze. And indeed, a key element of this government's response to Palestinian terrorism has been to bolster settlements, as evidenced by the recent decision to retroactively legalize 9 illegal West Bank outposts and to add 10,000 units to current settlements. So almost did anything constructive come out of this summit in Aqaba? And given Bibi's far-right partners and the political constraints of his government, are there meaningful de-escalatory measures you actually expect him to be able to implement?
Okay, so this is another good example of the gap between what people say and what people actually mean and what people actually are meaning to implement after saying or promising things. You've mentioned the death punishment. For instance, just a minute over this. Everybody who follows Israeli politics and Israeli security affairs knows that nothing would come out of this. That in the end, after Ben-Gvir going through the rounds of demanding a capital punishment and so on, nothing of that sort would happen because everybody who knows something about these matters understands that this would be, in fact, a boost for terrorism. That the other side would actually use that to make those terrorists into heroes, and every time this punishment would be given, it wouldn't be implemented because of the tensions over this. So going back to Aqaba, it's quite a similar thing is going on there as well. If this is an American attempt, and this has to do, the administration's decision has to do with Ramadan. Ramadan, the holiest month of the Muslim calendar, is supposed to begin around 21st or 22nd of March. It depends on the moon or something like that. So that we don't know yet. But traditionally, Ramadan is a period of more tensions around Jerusalem, more tensions between Jews and Arabs, especially when you have Easter and Passover and Ramadan together this year. And if we look back, Operation Guardian of the Walls 2 years ago began during Ramadan. So the fear is here, and the escalation is already part of the of what's going on. And the Americans are making one final attempt to prevent this. As you know, after Secretary Blinken's visit here, Barbara Leaf, who's a senior State Department official, stayed in the region in order to try to negotiate some kind of a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Then the Aqaba conference was held. Israel was represented by Tzachi Hanegbi, the new head of the Israel Security Council, and by Ronen Bar, the head of Shin Bet. All kinds of promises and commitments were made. All of this is quite vague. There's actually a document, I'm not sure if it's signed, and it's the old story about an unwritten paper or an unwritten document which is not worth the paper that it is not signed on, something like that anyway. So promises were made, and Israel said, yes, if things are de-escalating, then we will perhaps make less incursions into Area A, less incursions into centers of Palestinian towns, and yes, we will try to slow down new buildings in the territories. But having said all that, it's the same government that 2 weeks ago decided to build 9,000 new apartments in the settlements in the West Bank, and also legalized 10 different, there's a discussion whether it's 9 or 10, it's not really important, but 9 to 10 different illegal outposts as well. So Bibi has already taken that step, and what he gives the Palestinians right now is a sort of a non-commitment, saying somewhat vaguely that yes, perhaps we would slow down the rest of it. Well, he cannot move into the bureaucratic channels more than already has been decided on, those settlements and outposts. But even that is not enough for the right wingers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And of course, the incident, something I failed to mention, the incident in Huwara happens during the conference in Aqaba. So This is published once I get back in the afternoon, and immediately, since everything is done on social media, everything is done on Twitter, everybody's a Twitter star and more than a politician or a minister, then Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are immediately attacking him, and Smotrich, who's the more serious of the two, tweets something like, I don't know why this conference was held. I was not part of the decision making, and anyway, I'm not committed to anything that was achieved there. He is a senior minister, a member of the security cabinet, a minister of finance, a minister in charge of the territories, part of the coalition agreements with Netanyahu just implemented, and yet he said that he's not binded by this agreement. And this agreement doesn't say anything to begin with, because as I said, this is not realistic in any way, because Israel is building in the territories. So it's not a joke, because if it's a joke, it's on our expense. But it's very hard to take this government, if you're Jordanian or Egyptian or American, it's hard to take this government seriously. Netanyahu sends senior officials there. They make a certain commitment, whether it's written or unwritten. And then it turns out that the government is not binded by this in any way. So this is the way things are right now. A lot of those declarations, a lot of these statements don't actually mean anything. And what you find as a journalist is that officials from other countries sometimes try and call you in order to understand what's actually going on. Is this a real Israeli commitment or not? This is quite okay. This is the Middle East. We all know that there's a gap between reality and what people say and so on. But this is quite a long distance we've traveled if we look back at even the previous Netanyahu governments and we compare that to what's happening today.
As your colleague Jack Curry tweeted after Huwara, Huwara made basically the Aqaba Mifgash meeting irrelevant. So that there's that too. But I do think what you're raising a very challenging point, Amos, about how are other countries, including, I would say, the most significant interlocutor and defender of Israel, which is the United States, how do we proceed? How our administration or Congress supposed to proceed if basically the government is speaking out of several sides of its mouth? I mean, if a commitment is made at a senior level, presumably Tzachi Hanegbi and the head of the Shin Bet were representing the Israeli government. They didn't just go there on their own, and yet, high-level ministers are rejecting immediately what they have agreed to. So I do think going forward, that's going to be very, very challenging for the international community, to be honest, in terms of how it's going to deal with and relate to Israel. Also, just one more point about Huwara and in the aftermath. So in response to the murder of the two young Israelis, dozens of settlers rushed to the evacuated Evyatar outpost in an effort to resettle the hilltop. They were then removed by Israeli security forces to the chagrin of many prominent figures in the coalition. Protesting the re-evacuation of Evyatar and the Aqaba summit, Otzma Yehudit boycotted the Knesset plenum yesterday. And then there's also the shaky division of authority in the West Bank between Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Minister in the Defense Ministry, Bezalel Smotrich. Can you talk a little bit about what you make these tensions within the coalition and also how they impact the security situation in the West Bank?
Okay, so all of this is connected together, all of those points you mentioned. I'm not sure that there's one specific drawing to draw out of this or conclusion, but let's go over this quickly. So Evyatar has been evacuated a year and a half ago by the Bennett-Lapid government. It was not only did they try to reoccupy it on the night of the terrorist attack, but this was in fact a diversion in order to pull out the soldiers from Huwara, and this helped some of the people going on a rampage in Huwara to act more freely, because the army was busy both with the manhunt and regarding the gunmen and dealing with Evyatar. Then the day after that, not only did Otzma Yehudit protest what was going on and refuse to vote in the Knesset for the government, it's also that Ben-Gvir the new minister of so-called national security, what used to be Homeland Security, actually took the 6 members or 5 or 6 members of his party in the Knesset to a meeting in Eviatar. So the police and border police, Mishmar HaGvul, who were there in order to evacuate Eviatar, found the minister who's in charge of them sitting there and demanding to continue his discussion with the members of his party. So this is crazy. I mean, we've seen 55 years of craziness in the West Bank, but this beats everything else. This is a bureaucratic nightmare, and everything is affected by this. So we haven't. You mentioned that, but I still haven't got into the details of Gallant versus Smotrich. This all goes back to Netanyahu's legal problems. I think we discussed that a month ago when we last talked on one of these of your webinars. Netanyahu's only goal here is to stay out of jail, to get out of jail alive, and to, once his trial reaches an end, to avoid jail time, which is something that's clearly a realistic possibility if you follow what's going on at the district court in Jerusalem. In order to get out, he needs to go ahead with what he calls the legal reforms and what Haaretz calls the judicial coup or a revolution or whatever. In order to achieve that, he needs all those strange bedfellows like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. People on the far right, he never had a minute for in the past. If you look back, he refused to have his picture taken with Ben-Gvir during the campaign at Kfar Chabad 2 weeks before the elections. Smotrich was a junior member of his previous governments with no influence. Suddenly, Smotrich is not only the Minister of Finance, the guy who's in charge of the budget, the guy who can squeeze the IDF into submission and into all kinds of concessions and compromises because they need the money for their security budget, but he's also demanded and received authority over Kogat, the government, the general in charge of government activities in the West Bank and of most of the civilian administration there. And this is, again, unprecedented in any way. The leader, an important leader of a settler movement, a man who openly says that what's most important for him is changing the map of the West Bank by moving more and more Israelis there and establishing more and more outposts and settlements. This is the guy calling the shots right now. And he has to somehow divide authority with Gallant. So this is almost impossible to do. And what they've actually decided on last week, they finally signed the agreement. What it actually means is that he would be in charge of Jews while Gallant would be in charge of Arabs. Now, good luck with us complaining against the world talking about apartheid in the West Bank. And Smotrich is pushing forward because this is extremely important for him. This is what he's invested in. And if you look back 5 years ago, he, as a junior minister, a very young politician at that time, Smotrich published a plan, a well-thought plan from the right-wing point of view, of course, which he called the Decisive Victory Plan. And that was about the West Bank, and that was about collapsing and defeating the Palestinian Authority and reoccupying Area A's, if necessary, the Palestinian towns in the West Bank. And there was a notion there that he even wanted more, that if the Palestinians resist with force, then maybe a new Nakba is not a bad idea after all, maybe a new disaster for the Palestinians, and maybe a deportation of many Palestinians and so on. He didn't say that in so many words, but it was somewhere hanging in the air, the whole notion of this. So these are the people who are now part of the decision-making. They're not on the sidelines, they're not backbenchers anymore. They're people who Netanyahu relies on. And when you mentioned the fact that I was slightly more optimistic 10 days ago, it was about that. And you need to be a Marxist or Leninist to think in that way, and I'm not one, but thinking that it needs to be worse in order for it to get better. And I think that politically, it will get worse because people like Ben-Gvir will find it very, very hard to remain in government under these circumstances. And perhaps the collapse of the Netanyahu government would not begin because of the legal process, but because of what's going on in the territories. Think of Ben-Gvir. He was an expert troll for many, many years. He did nothing but provocations, nothing but getting the most massive media attention he could think of. And he was very, very good at that. But he never handled anything. He was never an official in charge of 2 or 3 people. He was always on his own, a loner, either a lawyer or an activist or mostly a media manipulator more than anything else. Suddenly this guy is in charge, and suddenly this guy can no longer rely on incitement against Arabs, but he has to give answers because the press and the citizens of Jerusalem, for instance, are demanding answers. Why is bloodshed on the streets? Why are terrorists walking free and so on? And he cannot blame anybody else. And so I think this tension is almost unbearable for somebody like Ben-Gvir. And my guess is that if things deteriorate and there are more and more attacks, Ben-Gvir will find it very, very hard to remain in the coalition. Perhaps the best move for him would be to pull out of the coalition, to leave and say, okay, I wanted to do much more. I wanted to destroy terrorist houses. I wanted to blow them up. I wanted to arrest and kill more people. I wanted to do severe things to East Jerusalem neighborhoods, but Netanyahu is a coward and he refused to allow me to do that. So this may be his excuse, his way out, if things continue to deteriorate. I'm getting ahead of myself. It doesn't necessarily need to happen, but I think this is one of the most sincere challenges the new government has. The problem in the territories and the effect it has on the political process.
And I saw that Avi Maoz left the coalition yesterday. If I'm
Sad
not
news,
mistaken,
but we'll have to live
Party.
with that, yeah.
But that doesn't affect the 64
No.
MK majority, right? And if Ben-Gvir were to leave the coalition, presumably he would still remain Chak as well, say part of the government. But
yeah, it's hard to tell, but this is uncharted territory. We've
Right.
never been in something like this before. We've seen political crisis, we've seen intifadas, but this is a sort of a perfect storm where everything happens together and very, very quickly. Also the Iranian issue, which we're not discussing right now. A lot of threats, a lot of things to handle at the same time. My personal sense is that Bibi, although he's an expert, he's a political magician, and this is what they call him for many years and for a reason. I think that this is slightly too much even for him, that you cannot have all those balls in the air at the same time without losing touch with the main goals.
And by the way, almost going back to Huwara, I mean, you know, Bibi did call for people not to take the law into their own hands, but it felt to me, at least reading it in English, that it was not a very strong statement. I don't really think you've seen the kind of leadership from Israeli elected officials in the light of the pogrom in Huwara, really speaking out and speaking to the nation. You also had mentioned to us when we met on February 16th that Bibi looks sick and tired and weak, and he has not really addressed the nation in some time. And one would think that after Huwara, that might be an opportunity to address the nation, but it seems that he passed on that opportunity.
He's satisfied with 1.5-minute videos been produced by his own people, and that's it. He seems nervous. And even this term of taking the law into your own hands, it's not the Wild West. It's supposed to be a democratic state, yes, occupying force, yes, in the territories, handling a very difficult situation. But what's this whole notion of people being in charge of retaliation themselves? It's a matter for the government and the state and the police and the military to deal with these issues. And he could have used much stronger language regarding that, but I don't feel, my sense is that it's hard to identify actual feelings from Netanyahu about these matters anymore, because he's so focused on his own survival and trying to, as I said, trying to avoid jail time.
I have a couple more questions, but then we have some audience questions in the queue. And just as a reminder to our audience, if you want to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box. Amos, what is the perception amongst the Palestinian leadership of the current deterioration in West Bank security, especially given the absence of the PASF, the Palestinian Authority security forces in places like Nablus and Jenin? Does the PA have any desire to confront the ascendant militant groups? And in the wake of the Aqaba summit, what other avenues for cooperation with Israel on the security front could the PA be interested in exploring, despite its superficial freezing of formal security cooperation several weeks ago?
Look, the PA is in a terrible state. It's not only Israel that's going through political turmoil. In the end, the PA, as I mentioned the last time we met, it's led by an 87-year-old leader who was elected, who faced elections the last time in 2006, and even then didn't really win this completely. So not to be too much of an ageist, it's hard when you're 87 to do anything about your long-held principles or to start working 24/7 under these circumstances. And he's having a very hard time. And he's not a terrorist in any way, Abu Mazen. He's played with the notion of, the fact that we're supporting terrorists in Israeli jails and so on. There are big issues there and big reasons, main reasons for Israel to criticize the Palestinian Authority. But Abbas, in his what is this now? In almost 19 years in power, never supported terrorism and was never behind any terrorist attacks, unlike his predecessor, Arafat. But his grip on both reality and the actual events on the ground is weakening as the time passes. And the PA is corrupt. The PA is deeply unpopular. Hamas keeps inciting against both Israel and the PA leadership in the West Bank. And also there's this young generation that I mentioned before, like Lion's Den, different organizations or lone wolves were involved in terrorist attacks against Israelis, people who despise the PA, who feel that they've lost their historic role or context and that they should be leaving control of the West Bank. So for all of these reasons, corruption, age, performance, whatever, the PA is probably at its weakest point since the end of the Second Intifada in 2005, 2006. And this is true more than anywhere else in places like Jenin and Nablus, where about 70% of the incidents either happen or are initiated, because most of the terrorists who attack inside Israel come from these two areas. Jenin and Nablus, and both of them, you may recall, are the northernmost part of the West Bank. So there have been discussions even inside. I've talked to Israeli officials who were in Aqaba. Even there, they talked with senior Palestinian officials about the possibility that the Americans and the Israelis would help, and that the PA's security forces would try to regain control, or at least have more involvement and more presence in Nablus and Jenin. The general sense on the Israeli side is that they're not willing to risk it, because if you're, for instance, a sergeant at the what they call the national security forces in Nablus, you may think that it's too dangerous now to gamble and to try and make arrests among the Lion Den's members if in 3 months' time the PA would not be able to control the area and they can come back at you and retaliate against your family and so on. So this is something that's frightening them, and they're not willing to take much chances over that. And you have to think of Hamas chasing them all the time, always behind their backs, conspiring against the PA and thinking of ways to overthrow the Palestinian regime in the West Bank. So there is, although, as you said, the contacts between the security forces were declared as frozen by the Palestinians a few weeks ago, it never materialized. They are on constant phone calls between the two sides. They cooperate every now and then. It's not full cooperation. It's not extremely useful, but this is the way it goes on right now. Some Israeli officials are saying it's not the end of the world. The PA is still there. There's room for cooperation. We can get their help. They don't want to lose this to Hamas or to the various newer organizations, and there's still work to do. Others are saying, look, there's no pulse there. We haven't seen signs of life. The officials are old and corrupt, and there's no hope there. I think Netanyahu, being Netanyahu, would like to continue in the same direction, meaning not to collapse the Palestinian Authority, not to move forward in any kind of way, but to play for time, kick the can down the road, as you guys are used of saying, and wait for and see what happens after Abbas dies. But we have to always think of the possibility that one day we'll wake up and Abbas is no longer there.
Sure.
Will there be a struggle for his succession? Will it be a sort of a troika of officials taking control? Will Hamas be involved? These are volatile times. It's quite clear that the PA is weaker than it was before, and that it's harder for the Palestinians to control mostly the northern West Bank towns.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I'm actually combining two questions that sort of have to do with your expectations or predictions. I realize predictions are always hard to make, but Amos, where do you think things are headed? I mean, do you expect that we are on the path towards a third intifada or a more protracted period of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian arena that could spill across the Green Line or involve Gaza? That's one aspect. But then also, I just want to link it to what we've seen as an outpouring of demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the streets to protest the Netanyahu government's assault on the country's judicial system. Do you think a security crisis in the Palestinian arena might draw Israelis' attention away from the battle for democracy? And how do you envision these two potentially existential crises developing in relation to each other?
So not a tough question at all. Look, as you said, everything is connected. It really is connected. Let's talk about the security side and move to the political side in a moment. Security-wise, I'd be careful not to talk of a third intifada yet. And this is because I failed miserably a few years back. There was a period of massive attacks between 2015 to 2016, about 6 months, in which dozens of Israelis were killed, and I think more than 100 Palestinians at that time. And these were mostly stabbings or attempts to run over pedestrians inside Israel and also in the West Bank. Most of these incidents were in Jerusalem. We call that the lone wolf intifada. And then after 6 months, suddenly it died down. And hardly anybody mentions that anymore. So when you talk of intifadas, is it something along the lines of the first one in the 80s, when there were tens of thousands of people on the streets of refugee camps throwing Molotov cocktails at Israeli soldiers? Or are we talking along the lines of the second intifada in 2000, where there were buses blowing up on a weekly basis in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? God forbid that happens again. So it's hard to tell. It's quite clear that violence is escalating, and that ever since March of last year, we're in the midst of a rise in violence, which is more aggressive and perhaps more dangerous than anything we've seen since the end of the second intifada. It's not yet a third intifada because the public is not involved. These are mostly lone wolves or small local organizations. It's not the people at large. It's not thousands of people on the streets fighting on a daily basis. It's not there yet. It could deteriorate because of all the reasons I mentioned, whether it's the political reasons on the Israeli side or the weakness and corruption around Abbas. And it is getting more violent and more frightening, especially if we consider Ramadan and the religious notions around it and so on. We'll have to see where this is heading. Hopefully, and we've seen that in the past, the IDF and Shin Bet, we can criticize some of their activities, but in the end, these guys are quite professionals at preventing terrorist attacks and arresting the right people and so on. And in the past, it has been proven quite often, there's no final victory over these issues. The conflict remains, and the absurdness of the situation remains, and the hatred and frustration on the Palestinian side are huge, and at one point or another it will blow up again. But slowing it down, de-escalating is a possibility, and it could be done. We'll have to see about that. Politically speaking, my sense is that the protests would continue, that this would get more and more serious for Netanyahu, that it's getting extremely hard for him. Although he sends all kinds of signs that he's going to double down on his legal initiatives and so on, it's going to be extremely hard for him to actually pass those laws. Although he has this quite, as you mentioned, quite a massive majority right now, and it's quite stable, everything together is much too much. It's sort of a Bermuda Triangle of challenges, whether it's the economy or the Americans or the protests, or maybe more than a triangle, because we haven't mentioned yet even the fact that so many miluimniks, so many reserve officers are now announcing that they would refuse service, something that unheard of in Israeli political discussion. This is going on right now. So this is closing in on him from many different sides, and it becomes very, very hard to handle. And this is why, from a political point of view, and it's no secret that the Haaretz is critical of those reforms, I have quite a lot of hope that this would be stopped, that this would be too much for the government and that they could not continue with this. I think this is disastrous for Israel if they continue along the same lines. And I think that this is getting hard for him. Will there be, if things escalate in the West Bank, will this be an excuse to just forget everything else? It depends. If it's a terrible third intifada, again, with terrorist attacks on suicide bombings every day, maybe the discussion would be different. If there are incidents every now and then, I think too much is at stake for Israeli democracy for people to just give up and say, okay, we're busy with the Palestinians, let's forget about the judicial crisis right now. It's not going to work that way. I think people are angry. There are close to 300,000 Israelis in recent weeks on every weekend marching on the streets of every town and village and city in Israel. This is amazing. This is 3.5% of the country. And this is, I think this is what makes me optimistic. I think in the end, it will be very, very hard for the government to move forward with all of these dangerous plans if there's so much resistance. And it's not resistance by just anybody. It's the heart and soul and the backbone of the Israeli society, which is involved in this political movement trying to stop those changes.
Well, I hope that prediction is correct. And in terms of the Miluinikim, actually a follow-up question from the audience, Aaron David Miller, who I'm sure you know, hi Aaron, wants to know how serious is the possibility of members of the IDF, reserves or active, or the intelligence services opposed to judicial reforms, resigning or refusing to serve. Former Mossad chief Danny Yatom said if judicial reform goes through, it would be legitimate to disobey orders. So how do you view that, and how serious is that threat?
It's extremely serious. It's why we had a front page story at Haaretz last Friday, me and my colleague Yaniv Kubovich, because the army is terribly worried about that. Not so much about the regular service guys, the career officers who will find it hard to refuse orders. But the Miluimniks are, again, the backbone of the army in many ways, especially in those elite units and places you mentioned, mostly the Air Force and military intelligence. And these are actually the guys who fought Israel's recent wars, because there were no ground incursions into Gaza or Lebanon. If you look at Guardian of the Walls and so on, it was the Air Force and the intelligence that were behind this. And the Air Force, for instance, more than 50% of the pilots, it's no military secret, are actually reservists. And if not many of them have actually committed to that yet. Mostly what they're saying is conditional. If the reform laws pass, then we will stop volunteering as reservist pilots. But for instance, the chief of the Air Force is extremely worried about this, and he's the guy who went to the chief of staff and asked him to speak about that publicly last week. So the army is terribly bothered by this. It's not what happens right now that bothers them, but the potential. If, I don't know, 10% of Israeli pilots refuse to train, then the army's capabilities, the Air Force capabilities, are less than before. And this is, you visit Israel all the time. This is what defends Israel in the end. This is what's important to maintain. And it's quite a surprise for me. It's not just Danny Yatom. I've heard from, I think, more than a dozen ex-generals who told me, yes, in spite of everything that we fought in the past, we now are not against refuseniks, where we would not condemn reserve pilots who would refuse to fly under these circumstances if the laws actually pass. So this is a serious concern. Netanyahu, I'm not sure if he's in a state of denial. He hardly mentioned that. But when you talk to the officers, which is something I do for a living, all of them are extremely concerned. I wrote a piece about a week ago saying that some of these officers are in a sort of a bubble, because most of the day they're not following Twitter. They're not following the news. They don't have much connection to the politicians, and they don't follow what exactly happens in the Knesset. And once you're inside the army, then you're part of them. There's the army's rules, the army's principle, and so on, and they all behave according to the older principles. But every now and then, they meet the world outside, and they're extremely surprised by what's happening. and frustrated, and they're beginning to get more worried. And it's not only there, it's former senior members of Mossad. It's hundreds and hundreds of retired Shin Bet workers who are now demonstrating, and some of them applying personal pressure on Avi Dichter, who's a former head of Shin Bet and now a minister who's thought of as the weak link among Likudniks in their support for Netanyahu and so on. So all of these people are extremely involved. There's something very militaristic about the Israeli protests, but in the end, it's also very, very patriotic. And I think it's important when you talk of the way Israeli politics are held, this is the way to do it, to use the generals and to use the uniforms and to use the ranks, to pull rank, if you like, in order to make a point.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions from our audience about the public reaction to what happened in Huwara. So first, Gabriela Goliger asks, is the Israeli public upset, horrified, concerned about Huwara? Is the apathy about the settlers beginning to abate? And then we have an anonymous question. Is it possible that what happened in Huwara will be a wake-up call to Israelis who've managed to compartmentalize and block out consciousness of just how awful things are for Palestinians of the West Bank due to the occupation of the violent factions among the Jewish settlers?
Okay, define Israeli public for me. It depends which part of the Israeli public. As the anonymous question has noted, most Israelis are avoiding what's happening in the territories. Most Israelis don't visit there. I think I told you that the last time we met. My home is, if there's no traffic, it's 45 minutes drive from Huwara Junction or the Huwara village. And this was a center of violence during the Second Intifada. And I remember going there almost once a week and then returning and being asked by neighbors, what's it like out there? As if it was the dark side of the moon. It was, again, less than an hour's drive, but for them, it was something that was happening very, very far away. That was true during the Intifada, and it's even more true right now because for most people, it's some kind of unclear reality happening somewhere else that has hardly anything to do with them. The problem is that every now and then, the territories have a nasty way of reminding us that we are not rid of them yet, and whether it's Palestinian terrorism or settler violence that remind us. And a lot of people, of course, a lot of Israelis who have strong principles and so on, feel very, very badly about what has happened. Others are saying, serves them right, this is the way to do. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And unfortunately, what you hear is some not just the far-right politicians, some right-wingers are saying that as well. There's sentiment among many Israelis saying, okay, these are the circumstances, they're animals anyway, let's behave the same way. And that's very, very frightening. And I think this is part of the results or the implications of a long-term occupation. I was born a year after the Six-Day War. This is the reality I know. For many other people, they don't even think about that anymore. This is part of the realities. Jews are up, Arabs are down, whatever, this is the way things are. But in the long run, of course, it cannot be maintained forever. In the long run, there will be a deep moral price to pay because of the situation, especially if you put in religion into the equation as well, which is part of the problem in my view.
We have a question from Martin Raffel. Will the Abraham Accords be affected by all of this?
That's an interesting question. Going back 2 months ago, you remember Ben-Gvir wanted to visit the Temple Mount the first week of his term as new minister. And Netanyahu refused. And a week later, he had to give him his toy and let him visit the Temple Mount. And it went by okay. And people said, oh, see, it's just the left and the media making a fuss over this. And then 2 days later, it turned out that quite secretly, the UAE canceled Netanyahu's planned visit there, which was a blow for Netanyahu because you have to remember one of his greatest achievements, and I'm not saying that, I'm saying this absolutely in an objective view, was the Abraham Accords. This was, if you'd like, it was Trump's only foreign policy achievement, but Netanyahu was the mastermind, the architect of this, and this was extremely successful, and he never got to share the spoils, because at that time there were different reasons why the Emirates didn't want him to visit. And now, once he came back into office, he really, really wanted to make that the first place of visit because Biden doesn't want him to come to Washington. And even that was canceled. And even now, 2 months later, because of the situation in the territories, it's still impossible for Netanyahu to visit. I assume that at one point or another, MBZ would allow him to come. But right now, this is affecting the situation. It does not mean the end of the relationship with the Emiratis. There's too much at stake here. Business-wise, things would continue, but you will see the Gulf states criticizing Israel over this. There's another issue I should mention, which is Saudi Arabia. What Netanyahu is selling right now, sometimes publicly, but mostly by leaks, is that he's on the verge of a major breakthrough with the Saudis, and at one point or another, he would get a normalization deal with the Saudis, like the Abraham Accords, and that would be the end of everything because it would bypass the Palestinians on the one hand and significantly improve Israeli economy on the other, and all of the damage done by the protesters and so on would be diminished or disappear completely. But again, I think he's selling. These are false promises because there are Saudis on the other side, and unfortunately, they have to agree to all of his great ideas. And right now, it doesn't seem as if MBS is willing to go all the way with Netanyahu. He has many demands from the Biden administration, and he's worried again about Jerusalem, and he doesn't shed tears for the poor Palestinians. But he's, in a cynical kind of way, he still needs to pay lip service to the cause of the Palestinians. And I can't see, I may be wrong on this, but I can't see the Saudis moving ahead with normalization with Israel, considering everything that's going on in the territories.
So we have a question from Stuart Gershon. Is there any way to cut down on gun trafficking in the West Bank? I mean, you referred to Lion's Den, and I understand they don't have any problem accessing weapons, and not to mention the other terror groups that are running around the West Bank.
It's the same kind of problem we have in Israel as well. If you think of the huge rise in crime of Arab on Arab crime among Arab Israeli citizens, close to 100 deaths each year, a lot of this has to do with the fact that so many weapons are out on the streets. It's very hard to collect them. It will be almost close to impossible to change the reality here. They make arrests, they catch a lot of weapons and so on, hundreds of them, but this is small time considering the number of actual weapons there are there. Some of them come from the PA security forces, others are unfortunately actually stolen from the IDF bases and then find their way into the territory. So right now they're fighting this, but this is very, very hard to do. There's not going to be a game changer regarding that. It's part of the reality. We have to consider the danger, the fact that there are quite a lot of weapons. Look, there was an incident about a month ago near the old city in Jerusalem, near Silwan, where a 13-year-old boy, Palestinian, shot and injured 2 Israeli settlers there who were on their way to prayer, I think, around the Western Wall. And he was using a revolver he took from his home. And that revolver was kept there by his elder brother for criminal reasons. He wanted to defend himself against neighboring gangs or whatever. But it's everywhere. And the 13-year-old actually knew how to use a gun and actually managed to inflict damage because of that.
We have time for one more question and then wrap it up. And of course, I want to be respectful because it is almost 11:30 at night in Israel. Although I know the night is young for you, right? Almost. Evelyn Kenvin wants to know, as long as Netanyahu has a majority, what stops the progress of the coalition's proposal? Will members defect?
That's a very good question, and I'm not a political analyst, but I'll do my best to try and answer this. If you look at just the legal process and the sheer numbers, yes, he has 64 to 56, and nothing could stop him. On top of this, I don't see any Likud backbenchers or senior ministers having any kind of conscience about this or thinking, well, this is terrible for Israeli democracy, I'm going to withdraw, I'm going to vote against Netanyahu and so on. The fact that his political machine is so effective, and what Bennett has called the poison machine on the social media and so on is so frightening that nobody in Likud actually dares facing him. Anybody who did, like in the past, Saar or Elkin and so on, is no longer there. I think that if something happens and if Netanyahu fails, as I personally hope will happen regarding his legal plans, this would happen not because of what actually happens in the Knesset, but all of the reasons we mentioned earlier: the protests, the refuseniks, the American pressure, the economy. Again, I'm not an economical expert, but the dollar is now 3.7 shekels or close to that. It was 3.4 or 3.5 a month ago. This is very, very troubling. Israelis are thinking about their pensions. Israelis are thinking about the price of living, the mortgages, and so on. All of these are extremely troubling. Anybody would tell you that, except for some very hardline Netanyahu supporters. So all of these issues together, combined with what we spent the last hour talking about, mostly the situation in the territories, I think this is where he might lose his grip on events and his control of the way things are heading. In the end, he's riding a tiger. He set this tiger free, and he's riding it, this tiger of legal changes with a lot of promise of violence and tensions in the street and so on. But it's very, very hard to control that tiger and actually lead it to where he wants to go.
So we're at the bottom of the hour, at the end of our hour. So really, Amos, first of all, Hamon Todah, I really want to thank you for joining us this evening from Israel. Again, a big thank you to Israel Policy Forum supporters who are with us on today's call. I do invite the rest of you to join the Israel Policy Forum family of donors by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. This webinar's recording will be posted on the briefings page of the Israel Policy Forum website. I also encourage you to subscribe to the podcast, Israel Policy Pod. Sign up to receive the weekly Kaplo column, which comes out every Thursday, and visit the Israel Policy Forum website to access recordings of previous briefings. So please stay tuned for an announcement regarding the next Israel Policy Forum video briefing. Till then, thanks again. We'll see you soon. And Amos, it was great being with you in Israel, and I hope to see you soon again, either in Washington or New York, or at some point back in Israel. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure we will be inviting you back on a regular basis, because you really have a way of unpacking the issues and providing a perspective that I think is very, very helpful to our audience. So again, thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.